Sunday morning, jumped out of bed, put on my best suit, got in my car and raced like a jet, all the way to you. Walked in your church with heart in my hand to ask you a question, 'cause I know that you're a Calvinist friend, yeah. Can I question your doctrine without any strife? Say yes, 'cause I need to know. Say I'll never get your blessing till the day I die. Tough luck, my friend, but the answer is no. Why you gotta be so rude? Don't you know I'm Christian too? Why you gotta be so rude? I'm gonna question you anyway. Question tulip, question you anyway. Question tulip, yeah, no matter what you say. Question tulip, ain't what it ought to be. Why you gotta be so rude?
Hello, and welcome to Soteriology 101, where you know when we play the Why You Gotta Be So Rude song, we're probably going to be responding to Dr. James White. I know, I'm obsessed with Dr. White. I know this just damage control I'm doing here because I'm so certain I lost that I'm just doing damage control. That's, of course, what James White continually says over and over and over again, even though we're just responding to his broadcasts. We're responding to all of his tweets and all of his material that he puts out there. And for some reason, we're the ones who are obsessed and doing damage control. I'm not the one who is floating conspiracy theories about me cheating by getting a text message from my Trinity folks during the middle of the debate, which I did not. Just like right now, my phone is on airplane mode because that keeps me from being distracted while I'm doing something else, because I am a single-minded type of person. You ask my wife, I'm not good at multitasking. And so it's one of the reasons producing is sometimes difficult for me, because I get lost in the weeds really quickly when a bunch of different things are going on around me. And so I didn't want to be distracted. I put it on airplane mode, but I'm being accused now, or it's a theory, like another conspiracy theory by Dr. White, that I was getting help during the debate. It's the only way I would have possibly known that the verbs or the participles, excuse me, I don't want to say that wrong again, the participles there in verse 45 were active rather than passive, as if I didn't know that before going to the debate. I've heard Dr. White's debate over this topic dozens of times. I've read his book on it. I know what he says about the passive reality. I had a whole page printed up beforehand. You know, my little notebook thing that's all little in sleeves. I have a whole page called Passive Reality. And that on that passive reality page is that about these being active, that listening and learning are active. And so the fact that he didn't think I already knew that or something like that, I don't have any clue. And the other conspiracy, I think he months ago I planned this ball gate, infant damnation stuff. I worked all that out in that 4-hour discussion with Warren McGrew. I had him time it just perfectly just to slip in that controversial topic there. I worked with Jordan behind the scenes, and I managed to get him to clip that out and put it out there on social media. And then I got all the Calvinistic people to just react. And then I made sure somehow, subconsciously just kind of putting things out there to get James White to respond to it. Of course, I also, back in 1987, got Dr. White to support one view of infant damnation, only to change his view later. And then I got Namer, one of his friends, to post online all of this. Who's doing damage control out there, throwing out conspiracies and all those kinds of things, and who's just responding to what's being put out. And again, another 2-hour broadcast by Dr. White on the dividing line, again, confronting provisionism. And guess what? I don't back down. I'm sorry. I know Michael Brown. I know maybe George Bryson, Del Tuggy, or whatever other guys you debate. Oftentimes you can just continue to throw out stuff towards them, and eventually they just stop responding. I'm not one to stop responding to people who continually bring false accusations or arguments. I'm just not built that way. God didn't determine for Leighton Flowers to be the kind of guy that just lets things go. I'm sorry, when it comes to the truth of God's word, when it comes to the love and provision of God, I am kind of a stickler. And I don't like to let something just be said in social media or online with thousands of people watching by a popular Calvinistic broadcaster, things that are unanswered. I just have a tendency to want to answer them. I know I've heard from even some of my friends and people that care about me. Hey, just let White go. Just don't even address him anymore. You just need to let it roll. I hear you. I felt that many times. I've thought, my gosh, if this guy did not send me dozens of people every week or month, I probably would have moved on, because he's not a good faith interlocutor. We all know that. That's why we play the "Why You Got to Be So Rude" kind of video, because he's not a good faith interlocutor. He's not trying to engage with us. And so typically I want to try to engage with people who do want to rightly represent us and do want to properly engage. I get that. But the fact that he is one of the most popular Calvinistic debaters in the world today, and that he's confronting our positions and he's putting stuff out there, I think it's well within our purview and our right to respond to those things without, hopefully, I'm not getting down to the level that into the mud and the mire. I'm not accusing him of any conspiracies. I'm not accusing him of cheating in the debate and getting help on something. I'm not accusing him of coming up with some divine, big conspiracy thing behind the scenes or anything like that. I want to address the arguments. And so what's what we're going to be doing today is I'm going to go through some things that I think we need to get back down to the main point of contention. And this is something that Dr. White continually seems to miss as far as I'm concerned. By the way, those who give super chats and questions on the side, I'm going to try to star and get to those at the end of the discussion, if that's okay. So just let me, that way, because like I said, my brain goes everywhere, and I can't keep focused on the things I'm trying to get done if I'm always stopping and looking at the side comments. So if you give a super chat or you have questions, comments, I'll try to star those and get back to those. They automatically get starred now. And so that's a wonderful thing, because I could never keep up with them before they automatically were starred. So I'm thankful for that. But real quickly, I do want to talk on the Greek gate. I'm calling it Greek gate now. The Greek geeks. Dr. Joel Korytko was on last time, and I allowed him to respond to Dr. White, because Dr. White had some critiques of him and all those kinds of things. Most of that, in my estimation, is kind of a red herring. It's a kind of a side issue. There's some important stuff there. I'm gonna let the Greek guys kind of handle that, and I want to touch on it just briefly. Here's kind of my rundown, like listening through both, because remember, Dr. Korytko, he responded to Dr. White on Zach's program, totally separate from me. He made the critique video of me. Remember, the critique video critiqued me just as much as it did White. Okay, so it wasn't a critique video of White; it was critique of both of us. And then Dr. Korytko went back on Zach's program and responded to White again in another video before he ever came onto my broadcast. And so just so you know the history of that, I didn't invent him or bring him out. He came out on his own. He did all this on his own. And like I said, he had just as many critiques for me as he did for Dr. White. So it wasn't like it was just completely biased or one directional. It was something that I was willing to learn from as well. And I disagreed with Dr. Korytko on some things, and I brought those things up in the broadcast. And guess what? People can disagree with each other and have a cordial conversation about it online and a discussion. It's really great. And I love having those kinds of things, discussions. I wish Dr. White was more open just to having Dr. Korytko on and just talking through some of these things. I think Joel would be really good at that. And I think he would be very kind. And he's a reasonable fella. Just talk to him. And what it seems to me, if I'm just doing kind of a overview of what happened, Joel, Dr. Korytko, Joel, call him, he made a broadcast, the first broadcast, and he made a comment about the very last thing that Dr. White had said in the debate about me bringing up the verbs being active, passive versus active. Okay. And so, because I was saying that they would need to be passive to better support Dr. White's position, but they're active verbs, and so active tends to connote the idea that there's some responsibility there on the part of the listener and the learner, okay, that they have to listen and learn actively. And that's kind of a passing comment that I made in the closer there in response to some of the back and forth that we had during our cross-examination. Well, Dr. Korytko made a comment saying, I'm not sure why Dr. White even brought up the fact that they are participles versus finite verbs, because that wouldn't make a difference, is basically what he said. And he explained that, and I'm not sure why White would bring that up. If he knows Greek, I'm not sure why he would even reference that as if it's supporting his position over Leighton's. That was kind of the comment. Well, White heard that because I retweeted it, and then he responded like this. So I'll just let you hear it for yourself. All right.
If you've not done work on John 6, then maybe you don't realize the fact that John uses the aorist when he's talking about false faith, and that the present participles are emphasizing true faith. So the one believing in me, the one gazing upon the Son, these types of things, you're just not even aware of it, but that's my ignorance, not your ignorance, because you didn't do your homework. And then the representation of my correction of Leighton's error was just a complete misunderstanding. He didn't even bother to listen carefully to the debate. So it's like, why bother? There's no reason to.
Okay, and so that's a little clip of what Joel was responding to, and he brought up aorist there. You heard that, okay, in reference to John 6 and the comment. So that's what he said, and so Joel did a response thinking that White was referencing the aorist as a portion of the reason why he made the comments about the participles in verse 45. And so Joel just interpreted that comment right there in that way. And then White responds by, I never even mentioned the aorist in the entire debate. The word aorist doesn't even appear in the entire debate, so you don't even know what you're talking about. And he came after Joel real hard, and Joel's like confused. And on Twitter, you see this back and forth, and Joel's like going, no, wait, you're the one who said it was about the aorist, not me. I'm just responding to what you're saying. And then the last discussion, then White spends 2 hours almost going over this whole thing when it could have been handled in about 10 minutes, I think. And it's much to do about nothing in my estimation. But just to be fair hearing here, let me show you what Joel says in response to that 2-hour broadcast we just heard from Dr. White. Joel writes this. He says, I just listened to James explain what he meant to convey by the aorist in his initial response to me. I do not think that was conveyed at all, even after going back and listening again. Still, I'm happy to accept that what he was trying to convey, that the aorist is used in context of false faith. He framed his initial comments to me about the aorist around John 6, so I don't know how else I could have interpreted him. Go back and listen if you don't believe me. And I did go back and listen, and Joel's exactly right. That's exactly the way you heard it just now. That's what it sounds like. He's rebuking Joel based upon what he understands, and actually kind of rebuking Joel's and attacking him for not doing his homework. Yeah, and Joel's like, what do you mean? Remember, Joel's a scholar. He does a lot of homework. He's done a lot of homework to get where he is. Oxford requires a lot of homework. And so accusing a scholar of not doing their homework can kind of set you on edge a little bit. And so Joel's like, wait a second. What are you talking about? I didn't do my homework. That doesn't make any sense. And so he responds to him. And that's what set off this whole Greek gate, as I want to call it. Okay. And so, but notice Joel is still, he's being reasonable here. He's even saying, I'm happy to accept that's what you were trying to convey. Now, I don't believe anybody who's rationally listened to both of us carefully, like, we've attempted to do, how you couldn't take what you just said as a response about John 6, because that's what it sounded like you were doing. But nevertheless, I'm willing to accept that that's what you meant. Okay, we can move on, is basically what Joel is happily conceding. Okay, fine, we can move on now that you've explained yourself, but don't blame me for your your comments. I mean, you're the one who brought up the aorist in this discussion. And so Joel goes on to say, however, James did not answer my initial question. What reason could there possibly be that Leighton's argument would fail based upon the difference between a participle and a finite verb? This is still not be answered. I listened carefully. It was not. As to his clarified position on the aorist and false faith, it is still problematic, even if the 3 or so occasions where John talks about people who believed with bad motives are in the aorist and once in the perfect, there is about 27 occasions when the aorist refers to true faith. This fact strongly suggests that John was not distinguishing his use of tense based upon the true or false nature of faith. There is no contrast with the present tense. White's response/book do not make sense. As an analogy, imagine a massive field with natural green grass. Someone comes and says, this 1 foot square is not natural green grass. Someone painted it green. That's why it's green. This is a big claim. The most obvious reason the grass is green is because it's just like the rest of the grass, green. There's no reason to claim otherwise. So also with the aorist used in these 3 cases. They look and act exactly like the aorist does in context of true belief. John is not distinguishing anything about true or false faith based upon the aorist. He is just doing what he normally does with the aorist. The burden of proof is on James White to show otherwise. End. Now, notice that really doesn't have anything to do with what we debated. If we'd have been debating on perseverance of the saints, like with Michael Brown or something like that, it does, because Michael Brown doesn't believe in perseverance. And so you might be arguing whether it's a continuing faith or a false faith or those kinds of things. And White's right that wasn't the main subject of our debate. But that doesn't change the fact that that's the way Joel took his response when he was responding to a clip about verse 45 and his reference to the aorist. And so Joel took that to mean, so what you're saying is that the listening and the learning, the aorist of the listening and the learning is referring to a false view because he's using aorist. That's the way he took it. Now, that's not obviously the way James meant it, but you can't blame Joel for that when you obviously said that in context in response to his comments about your reference to the participles in verse 45. So a lot of this is, I think, talking past each other. And if they just get on a phone conversation or a video call or whatever else, all of that would be taken care of almost immediately. And so, again, much to do about nothing. So let's move on from that. Let's move on from the Greek gate stuff into what I see as really the main point of contention. And that has to do with the subject of the debate, the question of the debate. Does John 6:44 teach unconditional election? And did Dr. White ever establish his case? I mean, for goodness sake, even Tyler Vela, if anybody knows Tyler, he's unfortunately left the faith altogether now, but he's a strong determinist, theistic determinist, and he's still active online. Even he has a video coming out, after talking with David Paulman, saying, yeah, at first I was on White's side that he wanted to debate, but now I'm siding with Leighton because, I mean, by default, and he says a bunch of bad things about me in the video, so you could tell he doesn't like me, but he pretty much concedes that Dr. White never established the contention for the debate. And so if someone like Tyler can be objective enough to say, okay, the point up for question of the debate, the affirmative has the burden. You have to establish the question. Does John 6:44 teach unconditional election? Dr. White never establishes unconditional election. He assumes it, which is what I knew he would do because I heard him do it with Steve Gregg. I heard him do it with Michael Brown. I heard him do it in response to John Lennox's book. Every single time he brings up this discussion and is confronting the view that I'm promoting, which is held by those 3 men that I just mentioned, he does this. He presumes tulip. He presumes unconditional election and assumes it. He presupposes it. He's a presuppositionalist. And what is he presupposing? He's presupposing unconditional election is true. And he reads John 6 as if it's true. And then just expects his audience to accept it's true. We're going, no, you have to establish it, Dr. White. You have to establish, because that's the point up for debate. You can't question beg. What is question begging? Question begging is when you assume the very point up for debate. That's what Dr. White did. He question begged the question of the debate. He never established it. And I plan to prove that to you. Listen to his first rebuttal. And before we put this up there, I know scrolling on the bottom of the screen is kind of the reminder. Those that can support us, please do. We appreciate that. We're a listener-supported ministry, and we've got a lot of new patrons even since the debate. We really appreciate that. I'm starting to do this more full-time, along with a new station I'm going to be opening. More on that. We'll give you more news as that's ready to launch. that I'll be teaching on other topics. Somebody was asking, do you ever teach on anything else? Well, yes, all the time I teach on everything else. I don't always record it on YouTube though, but I'm going to start doing some of that. So stay tuned for that. But I'm also teaching more full-time at Trinity Seminary. Check out trinitysim.edu. Also, link in the show notes to find more about Trinity Seminary, where you can get a higher theological education. And so we appreciate that. But what I want to put up on the bottom of the screen is what you're about to hear Dr. White say, so that you can listen to him and realize he does not see the point of contention. The reason he is not addressing the point of contention is that, in my estimation, and I'm not trying to be mean saying this, I don't think it's because of a lack of intelligence on his part. He's an intelligent man. I think it's because once you have adopted a certain way of looking at life and looking at things, it begins to cloud your vision of things outside your purview. It's kind of like the goggles. They say you put certain kind of goggles on and you see everything through those goggles, those lenses. And it's really difficult to see something different. It's the duck and the rabbit book we've talked about. When you're so used to seeing the duck, it's impossible to see the rabbit because your eyes are so fixated on the duck. That's what I think is going on. It's a confirmation bias kind of a situation with Dr. White. So listen to this, and it's on the screen in quotes what he's actually saying, and then we're going to address it.
If no one is able to come to the Son except drawn by the Father, and those that are drawn by the Father are raised up by the Son, that's unconditional election. I didn't think I needed to repeat that type of thing. It was fairly obvious.
All right. And so that was in response to my very first comment where I said, Dr. White got up here and talked for 20 minutes, but never established unconditional election. He just read through part of John 6 and said some things that were virtually benign, 95% of which I could just say amen to. In other words, he really never engaged in his opener. He in my estimation, wasted it of his 20 minutes. He wasted all but maybe 4 minutes of it, because only about 4 minutes of what he gave in his opener were even points of contention or even addressed aspects of our contention. Nothing established in his opener anything about unconditional election, as proven by this quote. Notice what it says: if no one is able to come to the Son except drawn by the Father, we affirm that. Nobody's able to come to the Son except drawn by the Father. And those drawn by the Father are raised up by the Son. We all agree with that too. In other words, I'm fine to concede that. As I said in the debate, in the cross-examination, I said it at the beginning, if those who are drawn are those who belong to the Father, because they have listened and learned from the Father, they listened to Moses, which, by the way, chapter 5 comes before chapter 6, and if you listen to Moses, if you listen to the Scriptures, you would believe in me. That's established before you even get into John chapter 6. So this whole reading backwards concept is nonsense, okay? You don't read it, you're not reading it. He's one reading it backwards if he's not accepting the context of the first 5 chapters of John, which well established this concept and idea that if you don't listen and learn from the Father, if you're not a believer in the Father, then you're not going to believe in the Son. You're not going to come to him. That's well established before we get to verse 45, as I noted in my opener. And so notice what he's saying. If no one is able to come to the Son except drawn by the Father, which we affirm, and those drawn by the Father are raised up by the Son, again, we have no problem affirming that. He says that's unconditional election. Dr. White, no, it's not. And you don't see it yet. Michael Brown explained this to you. This is what I was trying to get to in the cross-examination when I said, you've debated Steve Gregg on this. You read John Lennox's book on this. You debated Michael Brown, Steve Gregg. Like I said, they tried to explain this to you, and you're still not getting it. And I'm just like, brother, please, I'm not trying to be mean with you. I'm not trying to be ugly with you. I'm not going to call you names like you have me. I'm not going to throw out any conspiracy theories like you've done with me. I'm just going to say, brother, please try to come over, at least meet me halfway here and understand the point of contention, because this is not the point of contention. We can affirm with you that there are a group of people who belong to God. And that group of people at this time, in John chapter 6, that group of people are being given by the Father to the Son. You believe that group of people are those unconditionally elected and irresistibly graced. Okay, that's who you believe they are. Why do you believe they are? Because of how you read Paul in Ephesians 1 and Romans 8 and 9. That's why you believe that group of people is what they are. In other words, based upon your presuppositions coming into this text, based on tulip, Calvinistic presuppositions, you believe that group of people that belong to the Father in eternity past because of an unconditional election. You're assuming that to be true. And therefore, they're being given to the Son, they're being drawn to the Son and raised up on the last day. You're assuming that. You're not establishing it. You're assuming it. Okay? What is my view? That same group of people, we believe these are people who freely believed in the Father. They feared the Lord, like Cornelius or Simeon. Now you can make the assertion that Simeon was a God-fearing man or Cornelius was a God-fearing man because he was elected in eternity past and somehow regenerated or irresistibly graced. Okay, you can do that, but you need to establish it from the Scripture. You need to show us where Simeon was unconditionally elected and irresistibly graced. Where was Cornelius unconditionally elected and irresistibly graced? Because the text seems to suggest that this is something that was their responsibility and they could have done otherwise. In fact, there were many people who did do otherwise and were rebuked for that, which seems to imply that they could have done otherwise. Why would you rebuke somebody for doing something they couldn't have done otherwise? I mean, it only makes sense intuitively to punish and rebuke people and hold out your hands to people and long for them and strive with them all day long and long suffering, all those kinds of things intuitively seems to suggest they could have done otherwise. And so all those passages where I introduce the concept of like Jeremiah 32, 33, and the others, where he tries to teach them over and over and over again, but they turn their back to him. All those kinds of texts that I continually brought up, Acts 28, where they've become ever hearing but never understanding, ever seeing, never perceiving. Their hearts have become callous. They've closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see, hear, understand, and turn, and I would heal them. That seems to be a didactic teaching saying, had they not closed their eyes, had they not become callous, they could have seen, heard, turned, and believed. And you have to establish that that's not true. That no, they were born by default, unable to see, hear, understand, and turn, and their closing of their eyes was just a natural condition, and they couldn't have helped it. They couldn't do anything else. You have to establish that. And Dr. White never engages with that point of contention. So that right there, the very first line of his rebuttal, proves that he does not understand unconditional election in light of our view. He's not engaging with our view, because we're fine with saying that those the Father is drawing to the Son will be raised up in the last day. That is not established unconditional election, because it doesn't say why is the Father giving them to the Son and raising them up on the last day. We say the why is well established because they're true believers in the Father. And you say the why is unknown. We just know they were unilaterally picked before they were ever born. And you have to establish that from the text. You can't assume it, Dr. White. That is the point Dr. White has missed from the very beginning of the debate to 2 weeks after the debate. He still has not contended with it. And what's interesting is that even Rich, his producer, brings it up towards the end of the 2 hours. Like he says, wait, I have a question. And so even Rich kind of throws it out there like, what about this? And we'll listen to it, because Dr. White finally addresses the point of contention, and you'll see how he addresses it when we get to it. So let's pull that up real quick. This is the discussion. Here we go.
It is written in the prophets, and they shall all be taught of God. There's your genitive of agency. This is an adjective. So God is the one who is acting here, and they all are taught. They are made to be taught ones.
They are made to be taught ones. That's what the Greek is supposed to be communicating. This is why people who know Greek are coming out in droves and making videos saying Dr. White is reading more into the Greek than what's there. People who know Greek, and Dr. White, we've played the video of Dr. White critiquing Bill Mounce. Bill Mounce has written dozens of books on Greek because he's a well-known Greek scholar. And Bill Mounce takes Dr. White to task on how he handles John 3:16 by trying to remove the term whoever from the text. And Bill Mounce makes a case for why the word whoever is a good English word for, and he's Reformed, by the way. He's Calvinistic, but he says whoever is a perfectly appropriate to use as an interpretation for English. In fact, it's the better interpretation than what others are offering, according to Bill Mounce. And Dr. White says, well, just because you know Greek doesn't mean you have some kind of in-depth theological insight. And I agree with that critique, because you can be wrong in both English and Greek theologically. And so we both believe that what John 6 says in English is true. And we both believe what it says in Greek is true. That's not the question up for debate. It's how do we interpret it, okay? And if we're interpreting it from the English language, or we're interpreting it from the Greek language, or even Spanish for that matter, or German, whatever language we're interpreting it from, our theological presuppositions are going to guide that interpretation. And that's what I was getting at in my opener over and over and over again. That's why I was continually saying, guys, it doesn't matter all the Greek grammar nuances. I'm not trying to say that those things aren't important. Obviously, there's some getting into the grammar in the original languages and things like that can have their place. I'm not trying to say you just throw that stuff out. What I'm saying is if you have a bad presupposition coming into the text, you can have everything else perfect. You can be perfect in the language. You could speak fluent Aramaic and know exactly in Hebrew and Greek, you could know it all perfectly well, just like the first century Jewish audience would have known it. And have a perfect training in biblical hermeneutics. And if you have a bad presupposition, a wrong presupposition, like tulip, and again, that's our accusation. Obviously Calvinists would disagree that that's a bad presupposition. But assuming it's a bad presupposition, then wouldn't that lead to a bad interpretation of this text? Of course it would. And that's what we're accusing Dr. White of. Because he has this presupposition coming into this text, he's walking away with a bad interpretation, which is why you can't question beg. You must establish your presupposition, which is what I did and was trying to do in my Romans 9 debate too, is question their presuppositions, because their presupposition of especially the T of tulip and the U of tulip and the I of tulip, when you assume those things when you come into Romans 9 or John 6 for that matter, which is primarily about why Israel can't believe. When you don't take in judicial hardening and the fact that they're being broken off because of their unbelief, not from birth unilaterally because they're not chosen or elect and they're just by nature unable to believe in God. If you don't assume that's true, then what's the natural reading? Well, you assume that they chose to reject the truth of God freely. And thus they're being hardened in judgment for their unbelief. They're not being unilaterally cut off before they're ever born, as the Calvinist is assuming in the text. And that's why we have to address the presuppositions. You cannot assume them, okay? That's the point that's up for debate.
Theou, by God. God is the one doing this, okay? Now, I'm going to argue. Well, I'll argue right now. We'll go ahead and point out. What you have going on here is in 644, no one is able to come to me.
We agree no one is able to come to Jesus.
Unless the Father, and then hapemsas me, the one who sent me, unless the Father draws him.
And we agree with that too. And even Greek and English, we agree with both of those. No one is able to come to Jesus, the Son, unless the Father first draws him.
And I will raise him up on the last day.
And we agree with that too. And he will raise them up on the last day. Does not answer the question as to who the Father in this context would be giving to his Son. And we believe it is those who listened and learned from Moses. If they listened and learned from Moses, they would believe in Jesus. If they listened to the scriptures, if they listened to the Father, then they would believe in Jesus. Notice I didn't reference verse 45. I referenced chapter. I didn't reference verse 45. I referenced chapter 5. That's before chapter 6. Y'all know that chapter 5 is before chapter 6, right? Everybody knows that? Okay, just checking. Making sure you're paying attention, because that point is established before we get into the chapter. And Dr. White thinks I'm reading it backwards, as if that's a thing.
Okay? So, my presentation in the debate is just this simple. The act, now, by the way, as far as I can tell from what Leighton said, none of this is relevant today. Jesus isn't drawing anybody except maybe Jews to Jesus.
Okay. Even Dr. White on John 15:16 says that is not about Calvinistic election. That when it says, did I not choose you, the 12? You did not choose me, but I chose you, John 15:16. And a lot of Calvinists will jump on that passage and say, look, that's Calvinistic election. Well, even Dr. White is intellectually honest enough, God bless him for this, to say that's not about Calvinistic election. That's about God choosing from among his disciples 12 to be his apostles. Okay, we got a clip of him saying that. We've showed it before, because some Calvinists try to use John 15:16 as a proof text. Dr. White doesn't. Okay, so imagine John MacArthur, who does use John 15:16 in one sermon that we played. He uses it as a proof text for Calvinism. Imagine John MacArthur and James White sitting and talking. And James White says that. He says, well, that's not a Calvinistic proof text. That's actually talking about God choosing from among his disciples 12 to be apostles. And imagine MacArthur saying to James, oh, well, let's just throw out the Bible then. Now, I guess you just have to throw out that entire chapter. It doesn't have anything to do with us today, does it? Nope. Guess it doesn't. That's ridiculous, right? Of course it is. Because you know who he's talking about and who is applied to does not mean you throw out the whole scripture, throw out the rest of the Bible. It has no application to us today. That is preposterous. As I pointed out when he tried to make this same point in the debate, look with me back at this. Hebrews. God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers in the prophets and many portions in many ways, in these days he has spoken to us in his Son. I like the ESV even better as a translation of that passage. Not that it matters really, but long ago, at many times, in many ways, in other words, in various ways, many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. So how does God speak in the Old Testament? It says he spoke to our fathers, meaning the people before us, by the prophets. So like Moses, for example, right? If you listen to Moses, you would listen to me, because the way God spoke was through the prophets and like the law, the prophets, the scriptures of old, right? Makes sense. In these last days, however, he has spoken to us how? By his Son. So there's unity where? Through the Father and the Son. So it's still God speaking. He's just speaking through the prophets of old, and he's speaking now through his Son. It's still God speaking. It's still God doing the drawing, okay? He's still doing the teaching. That's the whole point. So yes, things have changed. Obviously, the new covenant, there's resurrection happened, Dr. White. The church was established, Dr. White. Yes, there's a huge change that took place. But to say that everything in John 6 is just thrown out the door because of that change is absurdity. It's ridiculous. And I think people who have any kind of objectivity and the differences between our interpretations recognize it as such, which is why I think people are reacting the way that they are to some of the commentary you're making on this discussion.
Now it's Jesus doing all the drawing. So this is all irrelevant. And I don't know if Korytko believes that. I'm sure that Korytko would realize that there aren't very many people who do believe that. But anyway, this is all just at this time period because God's hardening Israel to bring about the crucifixion. So right now, the only way to believe is if the Father who sent him draws him.
He always talks about the hardening of Israel as if it's something I'm just making up. When I read from John 12:39, and it says, for this reason you cannot believe. God has blinded your eyes, hardened your hearts. In other words, I'm reading directly from the text telling us why they can't believe, and Dr. White's assuming they can't believe because of a condition by default they were born into. So I establish my presupposition. Here's my presupposition. Here's why his audience can't believe. God's hardening them, speaking to them in parabolic language, telling them to eat his flesh, drink his blood, and not explaining it to them. And then I give a bunch of passages explaining and backing up that claim. Dr. White says, no, it's because by default they're born unable to believe. Okay, where's your backing for that? How dare you question me, oh God, oh man, or how dare you question me, oh man, or whatever. I don't. He doesn't have he just assumes it. He doesn't ever establish it. Doesn't ever even try to establish it because he's a presuppositionalist. Presuppositionalists just assume their point up for contention up. They just say, it's true because I said it's true. And you as the audience better believe it's true too, because then I'll call you a heretic if you don't, or a semi-heretic, which is where the whole Pelagianism controversy comes in. Oh, you just don't believe Romans 5. Oh, you're just a Pelagian. And so instead of actually establishing their view, they just label you with a heretic label and don't ever engage the point of contention.
And I guess he only does that for 11 people or something like that during the ministry of Christ. But anyway, so you have this action on God's part of drawing. And apart from that drawing, udais dunatai, no one is able, elthine, to come to me. Now, please notice that that term there. To come to me. To come to me. Why is that important? Because look at the end of verse 45. Erkatai pros eme. So, you want to, here's come to me in English. Then you look at the end of verse 45. Everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me. Okay?
Does that have anything to do with our point of contention? Nope. We agree with all of that. They cannot come to him unless they've been drawn, and those who hear and learn from the Father will come to him. Who's the group of people he's talking about? Those unconditional elected but in eternity past, or those who listened to Moses, who listened to the prophets of old, who listened to the Father's teaching and are now being given to the Son? Which one? He never even addresses that point of contention. He just assumes his is true and then points out things that we all agree with, and occasionally references Greek in there as if it's supporting uniquely his position.
So no one is able to come to me unless something happens. That is the drawing of the Father. And everyone...
All right, let me move over to, I'm going to go ahead a little bit because he's just saying stuff in Greek as if it's a point of contention or as if we would disagree with it in some way. All right, I'm going to go to 59:20-ish. Just start a look.
To hear is a passive action. Now, I understand that somebody could argue, I'm going to trip over this thing and we're going to have a great YouTube video as a result of that. As he just falls out of the, I'm not going to do that. Don't do that? Well, don't do that. If we monetize it, we'd be doing great. But I keep hitting this one's sticking out front, and we're going to have to spin that in the back, or I'm going to end up on the ground. Anyway, you could make an argument that you need to be able to see. So seeing, John chapter 9, is one of the, people who can see are blind, people who are blind can see, okay? Yeah, but that's still a passive reception.
Why are they blind, Dr. White? By default, they're born that way. That's what you assume. Or because they close their eyes. That's what we teach based upon what the scripture actually says. Okay? So your theology, Calvinism, teaches they're by default born unable to see. We teach they're blind because they close their eyes. That's the differences between the two. Notice he doesn't address the difference between the two. He just assumes they can't see because of the default condition. Once again, he question begs. He assumes the very point up for debate.
It's reception of what's outside you in the world. Your eyes are receiving impulses. When you hear, you're hearing things from outside.
Sounds like you're saying they're ever seeing but not perceiving, ever hearing but not understanding, which is the condition of Israel at this time because they have been cut off in their unbelief and are being spoken to in parabolic languages. And yet you're seemingly applying it to people born by default, unable to hear and believe what God plainly tells them. And again, you have to establish it.
The same thing with learning, okay? It comes to you This information comes to you from other sources. They say, yeah, but you have to work at learning and stuff. Well, okay, you might want to say that, but you can't work at learning if there isn't something to learn.
Of course, you need something to learn, which is why God teaches. And you're responsible for what you learn. If you don't learn, that's your fault, not the teacher's fault. Just like we said in the debate, we went over and over and over and over and over again because you kept asking the same dang question over and over and over again. And the question is answered. Just because God teaches doesn't mean you're necessarily going to listen and learn what he teaches. Just like Jeremiah 33 says, they can turn their backs, they can close their eyes and their ears to the truth. And that is their fault. They could have done otherwise. And there's no reason to assume they couldn't have done otherwise. You can't just presume that it's because of a natural condition from birth that they can't help. You have to establish that in the text. And you don't even try to, Dr. White.
You're still taking something in. And the problem is the synergist who wants to go, well, they shall all be taught of God as just everybody, or Leighton said all of Israel, and now he's saying something else, I guess. He admits he's got to change his book already, so I don't know exactly what it is he's changing.
Okay, let me explain that so people understand the differences between the positions. What I was saying to Dr. Korytko was that I could have just conceded that point with regard to, instead of saying all of Israel is taught of God, just all those belonging to God were taught of God. In other words, he teaches all those who belong to him. Of course, for Dr. White, that's the unconditional elected ones. And for us, it's those who believe in him, those who trust in him freely. And so it still doesn't hit the point of a contention. And so the edit in the book was to include both of those readings. I've actually had other Greek guys come back and message me after my interview with Dr. Korytko and says, well, I wouldn't give up on your interpretation that quickly because it could be taken that way. And they gave me some reasons why. And so I may have some more interviews on that. It just doesn't, to me, it's such a superfluous issue. It doesn't really matter to me because you're not being forced to listen and learn from the Father, i.e. you're not being effectually regenerated, which Dr. White ran from his previous position on what regeneration means within the word draw, as we already demonstrated in our other episodes. And I could have pinned him down on that had he just simply answered his question based upon his previous written statements and his recorded statements for that matter. But he didn't, so we were never able to get to those points of contention in cross-examination. I was never able to really cross-examine him on his view with regard to pre-faith regeneration because he tried to make regeneration not involved in the drawing whatsoever, like wasn't even attached, and ridicules me for even suggesting they're attached or related to each other in any way, even though his book says they are. And even though there's clips I've found that says directly that they are. And yet I'm the one who's misrepresenting him or doesn't understand his views and these kinds of things. And so that's where we end up talking past each other. If he would have just owned up to his previously stated positions and just said, yes, you have to be, because think about it, guys. Think about this. How do you listen and learn unless you're regenerated first? You can't. So before the drawing, if the drawing is teaching, like he says, teaching, the drawing is the teaching of God, where we listen and learn to his teaching. You can't listen and learn unless you've been regenerated first on Calvinism. And for him to say that regeneration is not involved in drawing, then you have to say that somehow these people are regenerated prior to being drawn. And where is that in this text? If you don't include regeneration with the drawing, then you don't have Calvinism. You can't have Calvinism. You have to assume that regeneration is meant within the drawing in some capacity, or at least preceding the drawing in some capacity. And where is that in this text, or any text for that matter? You just keep adding nuance after nuance after nuance. It's like they say is that Calvinism is a theology that dies by 1,000 nuances because there's so many new nuances to make it fit and to make it work. And the ordo salutis, and two different kinds of love, and two different kinds of calling, and two different kinds of everything, two different kinds of wills and everything else to make it all fit. And when you get under cross-examination and somebody's pressing you on this, then you have to be able to answer those things without running away from your previously established positions, which is what Dr. White did in the debate.
But he says Korytko has convinced him that he doesn't have to do that because in the debate, he made a distinction between Pontes and Pos. And I pushed that in the cross-examination because I was just trying to figure out where he's coming from.
Yeah, and I still think that position can be validly interpreted. Everyone in Israel learned, but only those who listened, everybody in Israel heard, but only those who listened came to the Son. So yes, everyone has heard the message, but those who listen, learn from what they heard, come to Jesus. Okay, so everybody in Israel, you could argue, heard what Moses said to them. Okay, but does that mean they listen and learn from what Moses said to them? No, that's their responsibility as to what they do with what Moses said to them. If they rejected what Moses said to them, if they didn't listen and learn from what Moses said to them, even though they heard it with their ears they passively took in this knowledge from Moses, but they didn't learn it, then that is their fault. They did that. That's their fault, not a default condition that they couldn't help.
How do you, you're not just.
By the way, I see the super chats and I'll get to those at the end of the broadcast. Thank you for those.
Walking through this thing, you've got external stuff. Well, the hardening of the Jews. And so this doesn't really matter anymore. Once you get to John 12.
External, what, the context, the historical context of the hardening of the Jews, the fact that according to Mark 4 and Matthew 13, Jesus, according to even John MacArthur's own sermons, he shifts to only speaking to the Jewish crowds using parabolic language, starting before the feeding of the 5,000. Mark 4 establishes that, and Matthew 13 established that before the feeding of the 5,000, he shifts to only speaking in parabolic language to the Jewish crowds. That's a given. That's not my opinion. That's just a fact of the matter. And in chapter 6, which is after the feeding of the 5,000, so we know it's in that stage where he is shifted to only speaking in parables, he uses very difficult metaphors, symbolic language, like eat my flesh and drink my blood without any explanation to this crowd. And you don't think that's relevant? You don't think it's relevant that it says the reason they can't believe is because these things have now been hidden from their eyes? Because he's now hardening them and blinding them in their unbelief and speaking to them in parables? You don't think that's relevant? Really? Why not? Explain why it's not relevant, Dr. White. Actually do the broadcast on that. That might actually be helpful, because then you would actually be explaining why my position is wrong and your position is right, which you never did in the debate. That's the frustration people have, because you never contended with the arguments that I made from the scriptures.
Oh, that's how it's going to be in the church age and all the rest of this kind of stuff that he's putting on this all the time, saying that I'm the one using my presuppositions and all the rest of that kind of stuff. Anyway, the issue is the synergists want to say, but this is a capacity to hear, and so you choose to hear, because everyone's taught, but it's only the ones who choose to hear and choose to learn. And so they are taking these and making them capacities and abilities, active capacities and abilities.
We're making them active capacities and abilities, or are you making them inabilities? See, we could say that we can bring the exact same accusation to you. You're making them into things we're not capable of doing. And Leighton's trying to say that we are capable of doing them. So we're both making a claim about these things. Now, the fact that they are active, the fact that God treats them as if they're responsible for not listening and learning, the fact that he holds out his hands to them all day long, the fact that he weeps over their unbelief, he marvels at their unbelief, the fact that that they are now cut off because of their unbelief in judgment, all of those things point to establishing that that is within their capacity, and therefore they're being judged for it. So I've established my contention. Where's yours? In the debate, where's yours that this is an incapacity? Because you just accused me of assuming it is a capacity, whereas I didn't just assume it. I actually demonstrated it with passage after passage after passage of why it was their capacity. Acts 28. Ever seeing, never believing, ever hearing, but never understanding, because your hearts have grown calloused, because you closed your eyes. Otherwise, what could they have done? This is a didactic text from the Apostle Paul. Otherwise, they might have seen with their eyes, hear with their ears, turned, and I would heal them. There you go. There's my proof that that's a capacity that they had they not closed their eyes. Where's yours? Your turn. Everybody send that little clip right there to Dr. White and say, your turn, Dr. White. Leighton did his job establishing it is within their capacity. Now it's Dr. White's job to establish it never was within their capacity because they were born by default, rejected by God, hated by their maker. You have to establish that, Dr. White. You can't assume it. And we're going to hold you to that. And you better believe I'm going to stand toe-to-toe with you. I will gladly debate you again. Gladly. I had fun. And I will gladly do it again because I will not back down to people who are impugning the character and the goodness of our God by suggesting that he does not love all that he has created. And yes, I'm passionate about that because I think it impugns the character of God to suggest that God is longing for, holding out his hands to people he secretly is keeping from coming to him without the capacity to come to him, and yet condemns them to hell for something they have absolutely no control over. Yes, I will debate you on that topic. Yes, I will stand toe-to-toe with you on that topic because every time we do it, more and more people are seeing Calvinism for what it actually is. A systematic theology introduced in the 5th century by a former Gnostic who introduced a way of thinking about the scriptures and a way of seeing God philosophically from a deterministic worldview, and has misaligned many people within the church, well-intending people within the church, people that I love dearly within the church, in fact, from misunderstanding salvation and the gospel and who God really is and what he has done. That's why I'm doing this. Yes, and I'm passionate about it, absolutely. And sometimes I get a little too emotional. I agree with you on that. And sometimes I talk too fast. I'm probably talking too fast right now because I am desperate for people to understand this truth. God loves you. He wants you to be saved. He desires for the salvation of every man, woman, boy, and girl. And I will sing that tune to my dying breath. Okay? I am going to continue to preach that. You can call me obsessed all you'd like. And guess what? I am not obsessed with you, Dr. White. I'm obsessed with the truth of God's love and provision for all people. And if you happen to be the loudest voice contending with that doctrine, then guess what? You're going to get a lot of my attention. Not because I'm obsessed with Dr. White. I am obsessed with truth. The truth of God's knowledge of good and evil, the fact that good prevails and that he desires what's good. He does not decree what is evil, but he desires what is good and wants our best because he's bringing about truth through the revelation of who he is. And I want that truth to be known. That's what glorifying God is all about, making him known for who he really is. I want to glorify God for who he really is. And who's the better representation of who our God really is than the person of Jesus Christ, who in the most climactic event in all of human history did not demonstrate his power over all of his enemies by controlling them, but his love for all his enemies by dying for them, self-sacrificially giving his life. So that needs to be the center of our gospel and our presentation. And so, yeah, I'm passionate about that. Absolutely.
And then using that to turn the whole text on its head and say it's not that the Father gives a certain people to the Son and they come to the Son. No.
No, it's exactly what it is. He is giving a certain people to the Son. Why is he giving that certain people to the Son? They were unilaterally picked before they were born, or because they believed in Moses. They believed what the Father had taught them. That's the point of contention. See, right there, once again, I showed you at the debate, he missed the point of contention, and I showed you still now, the latest broadcast, he's still missing the point of contention. He's not touching on unconditional election because he doesn't understand our perspective well enough to engage it. I guess that's why I said, you debated this with Michael Brown and Steve Gregg. It seems like you would get this by now. This is not a new view. He treats my view as if it's brand new or if it's something that's unique to me or something. I'm like, no, you've debated this view 2 or 3, 4 times, Dr. White, and you're still not getting it. You're still not engaging the point of contention. All right, and enough of that. I wanted to get a couple things. I told you all about Rich bringing up the question at the end because he never addressed it. And so Rich at least is playing enough tension back there in the back room, and I don't know if you can hear him very well, but he's paying enough attention in the back room to maybe my tweets or whatever else, and listening to some of what we're asking, and so he's presenting the question. Hey, Dr. White, have you answered Leighton's issue here? Listen.
Now, that was nearly 2 hours worth of material. All right. We have gone through the text. We have played video. We have demonstrated that the provisionist playground is cranking out all sorts of stuff that simply requires you to not have watched the debate. What?
Before you finish up, I have a question, because
So he's saying, before you finish up, I have a question. I don't know if you can hear it.
Leighton and company have also made hay, basically saying you failed to prove the thesis.
So he's saying, well, Leighton's saying that you have failed to prove your thesis. And he said others, I think probably Tyler Vela and others, other Calvinists out there, determinists out there, who are saying the same thing. You failed to prove your thesis, okay, is what Rich is saying.
Oh.
And it's like, but wait a minute. If the only one acting is the Father and the Son reacting, okay, but there's no motivation, there's no...
it's not what we do that is the basis of the condition.
We're doing there. Therefore, the condition is unconditional.
It's in God.
Only with the Father.
Right.
And the
Okay, so let me interpret what Rich just said. Because our presuppositions are true, it has to be the Father who's causing all this, is basically what he just said. But again, he's not establishing his premise. He's not establishing that we don't have a responsibility, an ability to respond to God's teaching. You've got to establish that we don't have that capacity. And he never even attempts to establish that in John 6 or anywhere else for that matter.
fact that they how did they miss that?
Well, how do I have ears to hear?
Okay, so when you say, how do they miss that? This is kind of like even when you see theists debating atheists, and you know, the theist will get so frustrated, especially if a presuppositionalist. How do they miss that when they're talking about the creation of God? Look at the creation, look at the sky and the blue and the intricacies of all creation and how intricate the human body is, and even the animals and the plant life and all that, it works together. How do they miss that? How do they miss creation? And that's kind of the way I think Rich is kind of saying, how do they miss this presupposition that God is the one who ultimately causes whether we listen and learn from him or not? How do they miss it? Because once you put those lenses on, once you see the world through determinism and through this idea that God's ultimately controlling what you do with regard to his truth, then it's like, how do they not see it? And I just want to say to Rich, if you listen back to this, we see it and we reject it. We see it and we reject it. We understand Calvinism and we don't think it's true. Now you have to ask yourself, why is that? Either because we're right or because God's determining us to be wrong. And that's something White does not want to answer. He mocks that, but it's just a problem with his worldview. It's the deity of deception argument from Tim Stratton. Go read it. It's a solid argument. And you'll see why it does not work. And matter of fact, he's about to get into it.
Here. And I have ears to hear. They have.
That's the part that scares the daylight.
Notice what he says. Let me back it up. Caesar, let me back it up just a little bit. I want you to hear it.
Now, that was nearly, because that's all he's got. So
okay.
He's not.
I don't want to go back there, and it won't let me do little small movements. It goes back by like 30 seconds or more at a time. He says they don't have ears to hear. Okay, that was his answer. Matter of fact, it's also what he said on Twitter. Let me put this up here because he says the same point on Twitter. Okay. So don't beat your head against the wall. Now he's talking to another Calvinist here who's contending with us. All right. And he says, don't beat your head against the wall. They are desperate for something to talk about other than what John 6 says. Well, one, am I desperate to talk about anything other than what John 6 says? Of course not. I want you to understand what John 6 says. I don't have to assume that Dr. White doesn't care what John 6 says. Notice I don't have to do that. I don't have to strawman my opponent. I can steelman him. I think Dr. White really wants you to know what John 6 says. And I think Dr. White really does believe it teaches unconditional election, irresistible grace, Stulip, and all that it involves. I think he really thinks that, and he wants you to understand it. Now, White, he can't just say, I think Leighton has good intentions. He really wants you. I think Michael Brown has good intentions. I think Steve Gregg had good intentions. They really want you to understand what John 6 says, but they're misinterpreting it this way and this way. Dr. White doesn't do that. Dr. White just assumes a nefarious intention, doesn't want to talk about what John 6 actually says. They don't even care about that. Nothing is to be done for them, he says. Focus on those with ears to hear, which is exactly what he said to Rich just now. They don't have ears to hear. Now, does Michael Brown, he affirms as a brother, he's affirmed me as a brother, okay? I don't think he's questioning our salvation or saying that we're not saved. So we're Christians. We're born-again Christians. And yet we don't have ears to hear what God teaches? Think about the logic of that, considering your views, Dr. White. Let's make this bigger because I really want you to see this up on the screen real clearly. This is what I write in response to that. So now hearing and learning isn't a passive reality for those who belong to God. Michael Brown belongs to God, according to James White, right? Michael Brown is a regenerate brother. He belongs to God. Is listening and learning, is hearing and learning a passive reality for Michael Brown to understand Calvinistic soteriology? We have the ability to hear and reject Calvinistic soteriology that you think is true? How is that possible if listening and learning from God is a passive reality? Do you see the contradiction? Dr. White assumes the elect are effectually caused to believe some of the truth of God, but not all of what he taught. On what basis can anyone defend the seemingly contradictory perspective? I would like to hear a Calvinist engage with that point of contention, because you've got God effectually causing some of his own children to believe some truth that he teaches, and that passively, apparently, because you're just passively taking in and learning. He's making you into teachers. That's what he said earlier, remember? He's making you into learners, and he's teaching you. So he's making you to be taught, but he's not making you to be taught right doctrine necessarily. So he's making you to be taught just enough to be a Christian, but he's not necessarily teaching you enough to be a consistent Christian or a right Christian with regard to important theological doctrines on Calvinism. Do you see the problem with this? When it's our responsibility to learn what he teaches, then it makes sense that we make mistakes. We misinterpret scriptures, which is what I think Dr. White is doing. And I think Dr. White has become more and more hardened in his view, not by divine decree, but he's become more and more hardened in his view by his own free will choice. And therefore, Dr. White is at fault for his wrong perspectives and his wrong views. I don't know how he can rationally say that about Leighton Flowers or Michael Brown or anybody else that disagrees with him, because he have to conclude that God decrees, for whatever reason, some of his own children not to listen and learn to Calvinistic truth, only listen and learn to other truths. And it just doesn't make any rational sense. It is not a consistent worldview. It does not work. And I wanted to make sure that was out there. One more, actually two more things, depending on time. We're at an hour and a half is my goal, so we're getting there. We're getting better at this, going a little faster. Maybe I'm talking too fast. I want to touch on this question about the conversion. At the end of the debate, there was an audience question about, do you believe conversion is a miracle? Okay, and Dr. White addresses that as well.
Changes that. But when you think about it, their position cannot allow for conversion to be a miracle, because that would mean it has to be initiated by the power of God, right?
Okay, so let's talk about that. Initiated by the power of God. We all believe that God initiates by his power, okay? Initiates the incarnation, resurrection. Those are all supernatural events that are initiatives of God. Initiative, the inspiration of the scriptures, the bride being commissioned to go, all supernatural. Indwelling of the bride through the Holy Spirit, indwelling those who believe and them proclaiming the truth. Those are all initiatives of God. So now you can argue about all the different various initiatives that you want to, whether it's prevenient grace or effectual grace and all the kinds of debates around that. But we can all agree that God takes the initiative and that there are supernatural components and aspects of what God does to initiate. Okay. So on Calvinism, think about this. If a Calvinist is being consistent, conversion, if you define it, conversion is the decision to turn. It's when you are going one way and you decide, I'm going to put my faith in Christ. I'm going to turn from my ways of old and follow Christ. That's usually what's meant by conversion. Regeneration is a different aspect of that. Now, Dr. White conflates the two, conversion as if it's the same as regeneration. And even on Calvinism's Ordo Salutis, that's not the way it works. Regeneration precedes conversion on Calvinism. So the faith response is as a result of the miracle. So God miraculous. That's why I was trying to get to the drawing issue with Dr. White, because he would have to say the drawing is a miracle. The drawing is regeneration. And instead, he ran from his previously stated position and makes drawing merely teaching of God. And teaching of God is not necessarily miraculous. Now, you can say aspects of it if he's inspiring Samuel, whenever in 2 Samuel, when it says the words of the Spirit were on my tongue, David speaking, you could talk about a supernatural way in which God can inspire his words to be spoken through human vessels and those kinds of things. But, whether you call that a miracle or not is all up for debate. And my whole point is like, everything's a miracle in determinism, right? Everything's supernatural because everything's brought about by God's divine supernatural decree. So, I mean, what's not a miracle on that worldview, really? Because everything's ultimately being brought by God's supernatural work in some way. It's doing it through means, maybe, but he's still the one bringing it all about. So there's no real distinction between what's of God and what's not of God on a deterministic worldview. But nevertheless, even on the Calvinistic Ordo Salutis, it's regeneration that's the miracle. That's the change of the heart of flesh to the heart, the heart of stone to the heart of flesh. And by the way, I have no problem saying regeneration is a miracle, okay? But that's not the question I was asked. The question I was asked is whether conversion, the decision to put your faith in Christ, is a miracle. And even on Calvinism, it's not. So this is what's ironic about that question. It can be an effectual result of the miracle, i.e., his nature was changed through a work of regeneration, a miracle, and that therefore he now freely chooses to put his faith in Christ, which is not a miracle, okay? It's a result of the miracle, right? So regeneration is the miracle. Conversion is the result of that miracle, right? Well, I can say virtually the same thing. Inspiration is a miracle. Revelation is brought miraculously. Those are miracle things. And then conversion is the response, but it's a free response. It's not an effectual response. In other words, it's not being caused. It's the only difference between us and the Calvinists is that they believe it's being caused by God. He's effectuating the decision. We don't agree with that. We don't believe that that's true. And for him to act as if this is just a newfound, oh my gosh, Leighton just stepped into all kinds of heresy there. Every single non-Calvinist throughout Christian history would say the exact same thing. None of them believe it's an effectual miracle that you believe in Jesus. If they do believe it's an effectual miracle that you believe in Jesus, i.e. convert to Jesus, then they're a Calvinist by default, because that's the definition of what a Calvinist is. Conversion is by an effectual miracle of God causing you to believe. And every non-Calvinist disagrees with that. So for me to answer that question as to say, well, conversion itself is not a miracle, one, that's not even unique to my perspective. Even Calvinists wouldn't say that if they're being precise. And secondly, it's nothing new to what any non-Calvinist has ever said throughout Christian history who knows what they're talking about and doesn't conflate the terms. But nevertheless, here's what Dr. White says. I'll back it up. Listen.
Their position cannot allow for conversion to be a miracle, because that would mean it has to be initiated by the power of God, right?
Well, and we believe it's initiated by the power of God too. You believe it's initiated by the power of God with effectual results, i.e., he causes the belief of his elect. And we believe it provides the necessary knowledge and understanding for one to respond willingly or suppress the truth and unrighteousness. In other words, they can receive the truth or reject it freely. And that's their responsibility. In other words, they're held culpable for what they do with what they hear from the Father.
Not just by, because in his answer, he talked about, all the miracles that surround conversion. You have to have the gospel and things like that. But everybody heard he didn't answer the question, is conversion itself miraculous? And my response was, I said, he takes out a heart of stone and gives a heart of flesh. It's the greatest miracle that takes place.
That's regeneration, not conversion. So he just said the same thing I would say. I believe his taking out our heart of stone and putting in a heart of flesh is a result of our putting our faith in him. In other words, you confess that you have a corrupt heart in order to get a new heart on our view, and that is miraculous. So regeneration can be miraculous on provisionism, and that's what he just described as miraculous was regeneration. But that precedes conversion on Calvinism. So he's not being precise, and that's part of the problem. And I wanted to address that. The last thing, since we're at 115 and 130 was my goal, I want to address this. I know it's been addressed on a couple of other channels and other places, but this is, I think, really vital because continually brought up is Leighton not being on topic because he asked about infants who die and using the rob to reprobate, concept of there's somebody in the audience there in John 6 who drops dead. On what basis is he judged? And Dr. White answers, well, on the basis of, Romans 5, he's an Adam. And so he's not being necessarily judged for his own refusal to believe what the Father had taught, as if he could have done otherwise, but he's really being judged based upon the guilt he inherited from Adam, is basically the answer that I remember Dr. White giving. And so I wanted to press further and demonstrate to the audience that Dr. White's willing to say that no matter how incapable Rob is to respond to the Father and to respond to the revelation, this person is unconditionally guilty. Just like he's unconditionally elected to salvation, that means he's by default unconditionally elected to damnation. That's what reprobation is all about. And therefore you can't ignore that. And yes, that has to do with unconditional election. Now, some people may not think it's applicable. Who are you to make that decision, though? Who are you, the arbiter, to decide what I can ask about the implications of your doctrines? Dr. White does it all the time. When he's debating different points of theology, he asks about implications without reference necessarily to a particular passage that's being discussed. And that's well within the purview of a debate, to ask about the implications of a particular theology. And so if we're debating, is Jesus teaching unconditional election to this crowd of Jews? And I point out a negative implication, a difficult and yes, maybe even emotional implication of your system, doesn't mean you can appeal to the moderator and avoid answering the question. And by the way, just because something is emotional doesn't mean it's based upon an emotion. It can be a solid argument with credentials behind it and yet still be emotional, but still have to be answered. So just because you can't make an argument purely on emotion, nor can you dismiss an argument purely because it's emotional. Either the argument is valid or it's not. And so if the argument is valid, that these people are being held accountable for something they have no control over, and therefore intuitively, as demonstrated when infants die, and the inconsistency of Calvinism in answering the question with regard to infants demonstrates the problem with unconditional election, whether Dr. White wants to admit that or not, or wants to address it or not because of the difficulty within a debate format. He doesn't have the right to make those decisions. There's no rule. I never got a rule book or a list of guidelines saying every question has to be confined to the text of John 6, or that you cannot ask questions about negative implications of your system. For example, I fully expected Dr. White, even had in my notes ready for Dr. White to make the comments about, well, you'll hear him all the time, any consistent Arminian or any consistent synergist has to be an open theist. And I was ready for that question. Now, I could have said that has nothing to do with John 6 and appeal to the moderator, but I had planned and ready to answer that question because I know it's a difficult question. I would have been pressed on about omniscience. If you affirm omniscience, then God would know beforehand who's going to believe and who's not. So why would God create somebody who he knows is going to choose not to believe? I mean, I was expecting that question because I get that kind of question all the time as a non-Calvinist who believes in omniscience, right? So I had no plan to appeal to the moderator on difficult questions like that. Okay. I had a ready to go answer. Dr. White appeals to the moderator instead of answering the question. And since then, because they brought up all these different quotes off of whatever it's called. I can't remember the name of the website, but there's a website where you can look up where all the different words are mentioned. So I just pulled up different times where Dr. White teaches on the infant issue of infants and election with the doctrine of election. And it's interesting that even Dr. White mentions infants and the salvation of infants and damnation of infants in his discussion over the doctrine of unconditional election, proving that it is relevant. So I want you to listen to this portion real quick.
Past, almost 40 years, not quite there, just mind-numbingly the same. Just example after example from debates and radio programs said the same thing about elect infants. When people would ask the question, I would answer it and say, well, you've got the extreme over here, you got the extreme over there. In the middle, you've got the position that's,
Notice what you just said. I get this question all the time, and I answer it, and here's my answer, and it's real simple. And he gives a little less than 30-second answer to this question all the time. And he gives it to in other debates. He talks about it all the time. And yet in my debate, when I ask him the question, he refuses to answer. And you have to ask yourself why. I think it's because he knows it reveals the inconsistency of unconditional election.
Provided for you in the Westminster Confession of Faith, in London Baptist Confession of Faith, where you believe in elect infants. If an infant is saved, it's because of the grace of God. And just example after example after example, it's almost embarrassing. Because, here's one from 2005. Oh, here's one from 2008. Blah, 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 it's the same thing. So you have one twin who is fallen in Adam, and he will receive justice. And you have another twin who is also fallen in Adam, and he will receive grace. And what's being said is, God can't do that.
Okay, so what we just heard there is him talking on unconditional election using Romans 9 and the twins, infants, before they're born, okay? One is chosen for salvation by his grace, the other for damnation to demonstrate his justice. That is the doctrine of unconditional election. And he's referring to infants, two twins. And that's not related. That's off topic. Really? Think about that.
Infant enters in the kingdom of God by grace because God is good. Another infant deservedly does not enter because God is just. There is no question of fate in either case because God does what he wishes. But although we know that one is condemned according to the judgment and another is delivered according to the mercy, of him whose mercy and judgment we praise with confidence, who are we to ask God why he condemns the one instead of the other?
With the parents in an infant death situation, the vast majority of them simply want you as a minister to exercise an authority you do not have, to basically pass their loved one into heaven, as if you have that capacity, you have that ability to do that, which you don't. But that's what they want. And there's tremendous pressure put upon you because you know exactly what they want. And when someone is grieving, is that really the time to be theologically accurate? Yeah, it is.
He's going to have elect infants, and then there are others who will not be. And I don't know what basis to put that on other than the same basis of all the rest of us, as a demonstration of his glorious grace.
As you may have, I'm not sure if you were quoting me when you were talking or not, I believe that God has the exact same freedom in the salvation of infants that he has in the salvation of adults.
That's not my question.
Well, but I'm explaining it since you asked, are there quote-unquote babies in hell? I believe that God has the same freedom in the salvation of infants that he has in adults. Since all of us, no matter what our stage of development, are fallen sons and daughters of Adam, then God would not be under any compulsion to show mercy to anyone. But I believe that he does, based upon the very same freedom that he has in saving any adult person as well. So,
translation, there are probably some babies in hell. All right. How Dr. White maneuvers here is a very clever way of answering the question. Okay. He's removing the emotionally rhetorical force of the question in order to provide the logical answer from the Christian perspective, from the perspective of, I suppose, Calvinism.
Right. From the, not just Calvinism, and this is where I would correct Nate, which, by the way, Nate was very kind to Dr. White in his reviews in the past, but notice that Nate's being objective enough to know and say, in translation, you do believe that God does punish some infants in hell. That is Dr. White's view, and I have every right to press on a view that is inconsistent with the mainstream Calvinists like John MacArthur, Piper, Steve Lawson, and many others that we've quoted here before, who do not believe in infant damnation, and who stand against White's view. And White has publicly contended with their view on stages before, and yet it's supposed to be off limits on my stage when I have a right to question his doctrine of unconditional election. Yet, and again, to be fair, here's what John MacArthur, another Calvinist, says in contrast to what Dr. White has taught.
In grace saves the little ones that die. And I think the case is made all through the scripture that he does that. In the Old Testament, for example, when pagans, idol worshippers, offered their children to Moloch and set their baby on a fire, and it was incinerated, the prophet Jeremiah called it the death of the innocents. God even refers to those sacrificed babies as innocent. That's pretty significant. They are innocent, which means they're not guilty.
Okay. And so I want to, here in closing, we're coming up the last 5 minutes, and so I want to make sure I get in the super chats, and I appreciate those who have given. First, Amptown, thank you for your super chat. Were you ever really a Calvinist? Yeah. I think he's probably saying tongue in cheek. And by the way, my son has uncovered some old VHS tapes. When we moved to a townhouse. We're kind of downsizing because a lot of our money is going out now towards tuition payments, and so we got a smaller place, and we moved. And he found a bunch of VHS tapes, and he's digitizing them. And it's quite interesting listening to some of my old sermons, because a lot of them are recorded on VHS tapes. And so there may be something coming that you'll enjoy hearing. You might have a Leighton versus Leighton, young Leighton versus older Leighton debate coming up before too long. So you stay tuned for that. And so yeah, thanks for that comment, and thanks for super chat, Chase. I get tired of the argument that we limit God, what God can do. We agree he can do anything he wants. It's a question of what he will do per the Bible. Exactly. You'll hear that a lot, where they'll treat free will like a superpower and all these kinds of things, like we're somehow limiting God or tying God's hands, or God can't do something. It's not about what God can or can't do. It's what God has chosen to do and what he's revealed about himself in Scripture. So thank you for that. Aaron, thank you for your super chat. You did all that stuff and continued your duties at Trinity and Texas Baptist. That's amazing. Well, Trinity, I'm working more full time with them. Before, I was more of an adjunct before, and now I'm full time with Trinity as a professor. And I no longer work with Texas Baptist, but I am going to be doing not only Soteriology 101 full time, but I'm opening up another teaching ministry page. More information on that to come. And so stay tuned for that. So people have asked, you don't teach on anything but Calvinism? I always remind them, on this page, that's what I teach about, and that's what I talk about on soteriological issues with Calvinists and Arminians and those kinds of things, because that's what this page was created for. But when I'm traveling and teaching, I very rarely even bring up Calvinism or soteriology. I teach on a range of other topics and written on a range of other topics. But now I'm finally going to bring it to a YouTube channel. And so stay tuned for that. It is coming. Amptown, thank you again for another super chat. Sorry, Dr. Flowers, I forgot to add LOL to my first chat. Okay, thanks. I knew you were LOLing, so thanks anyway, though. Josh Hicks, off topic, so I apologize. Looking for non-Calvinist women authors to recommend for my wife, but I'm having trouble. Any suggestions? Thanks. Women authors, not off the top of my head, but Josh, now that that's been up on the screen, I imagine if you watch the super chat now, I'm going to ask all of our listeners. We have over 1,000 watching right now. I bet you there's some good recommendations. And if I thought about it and went and looked at my bookshelf, I've got some, but I'd have to go look. And so I wasn't prepared for that question. But if you watch the side chat right now, Josh, I bet you get some good good suggestions. AK, hey, AK. AK, were you the one that I watched your discussion just recently with Jeremiah? I think that may be AK Richardson, who has a channel himself. I really enjoyed that discussion, and AK did a really good job. If this is the same gentleman I'm thinking of, did a really good job defending what I would consider as provisionism and the view that I hold to. And I was really surprised by that, because so oftentimes when I tune into stations where people are taking a more Arminian or non-Calvinistic approach, I hear more of a classical Arminian kind of approach, God looking through time or whatever, kind of stuff like that, or a differing view on John 6 than the one I was promoting. But AK, at least on that particular broadcast, was saying exactly what but I would have said in many situations. And so I was really intrigued by that conversation and appreciated hearing that. So I'm not sure if that's the same AK, but I think it may be. Tim, thank you for your super chat. Hey, Leighton, could you bring a copy of your latest book next time you're in Tigertown for me to buy? Oh, hey, Tim. I do plan on coming to Lighthouse again. I'm not sure when that's dated, but I will try to remember to bring a box of my books because I have not made those available to you fine folks there in Tigertown recently. So I will try to remember to do that. Get Dr. Pauls to text and remind me before that date. Dr. Pauls is the interim pastor there, or I guess he's been the pastor there for a while, and he has my number, Tim. So tell him to remind me to bring my books, and I'll be glad to do that. But thanks for that. Line in the Sand Church. Wish you would have called him out for hiding behind his Greek. Bullies need to be called out. However, was impressed by your debate. Well done, sir. Yeah, I had planned if he really pressed me on Greek, which he really didn't. He wasn't, I really expected him to come further with the Greek or really press me on Greek issues. And I think he might've been trying to kind of go that way here and there. And I just didn't take the bait. But I was well prepared just to say, I'm not a linguist. I don't claim to be a scholar in Greek. If you want to debate, Greek issues, then get a Greek speaking person here to debate them, because I'm not your man with that. I think the English is perfectly sufficient to defeat the Calvinistic presuppositions in this particular debate, though, which is a bit of my line. But yeah, that's a good observation. Chris Harris, thank you. No, Leighton, James White never dogmatically said infant who dies in infancy goes to hell. I just played you a clip of him saying exactly that. And so if you're not willing to hear it, Chris, I can't help you. And even Nate concluded, that's what even Nate's conclusion of what his answer was yes. If you're not elect, where else do you go if you're not elect? And you'd have to suggest that. Well, and he even says when he reads from Augustine that one enters in heaven to demonstrate his grace, the other doesn't in order to demonstrate his justice. And that's a repeat of what Dr. White actually said in the clip just before that, Chris. People, that right there, ladies and gentlemen, is proof positive that people will hear what they want to hear. I can play a direct clip from Dr. White himself saying, one twin enters in to heaven displaying his grace and the other does not, displaying his justice. And another guy and a person responds and goes, that's not what Dr. White says, even though I just played a clip of him saying it. People will hear what they want to hear, no matter what you tell them. Once they're set on something, that's even says, Nate did not conclude that. Listen again carefully to what Nate said. Oh, I'm so tempted to go back and play it again, but I'm not going to buy into the delusion that you're in, Chris. He said, translation, some infants are in hell. That's the translation of what he said Dr. White said. Again, all right. You're not going to keep going over it, but we'll have to agree to disagree that and move on. But I did want to make sure that we did cover some of those things. But I do, Chris, nevertheless, I do appreciate the super chats. And wanted to make sure I covered everything here. I'm looking at these portions. Yes. I'm making sure I got all my things here. Yeah, I got them all. Okay. Like I said before, I do want you to remember that a new broadcast is going to be starting soon. The book, God's Jesus, Drawn by Jesus, should be out in the next day or two. So I will be announcing that. Watch social media. If you're not following me on Twitter or on Facebook page or any of the social media outlets, go do that now. And that, because that's where we kind of make announcements and get things out like this. And so we are working on the final kind of touch-ups on the book. And so it should be published and out and ready in the next day or two. So be watching for that. And I'll try to remember to bring some to Tigertown for those that want them there at Lighthouse. And so hopefully that's helpful as well. So Let me remind you, as always, go now, share Christ, and show love. God bless.